Hey everybody, this is Anoop. We are on the fifth episode of the series on second mind medicine. And today we'll be looking at the topic of mental health and mental illness. So as usual, just chime in and let me know if the audio and video are coming in okay. You can see that I've put the term mental health in quotes because I want to encourage each of us to look closely at this phrase and at the power of language and what it suggests. I think this is a key aspect of deconstructing this and building a foundation on knowledge. So hello again, and let me know if this is coming through. All right, MJ, I see you're there on Twitter. Socorro Rodriguez. Okay, great. Looks like we're coming through okay. And what I'd like to do to get started, since we're looking at this idea of mental health, is just talk about what we're going to do today. What we're going to do is look at our understanding overall of mental health and mental illness, these phrases and what they mean. We're going to deconstruct the foundation under these, and we're going to try to create a new foundation that's based in love and based in understanding. All right. If you look at the understanding of mental health and mental illness, and if you look at the education around this, you will see that probably one of the words that is most commonly missing in talking about this is love, right? Ultimately, when we're talking about what we're calling mental illness, we're talking about suffering. To put it in very simple terms, we're talking about suffering and we're talking about experiences of distress. And so, one of the key things to talk about, to experience, to focus on is also love. So, it is not just a matter of understanding frameworks, which I think is very important, but also the experience of love. So, hopefully, we can keep that as a focus throughout this broadcast, throughout this conversation, as a focus on love as well as understanding. All right. So, how do we do that? Well, first of all, I know that many people are tuning in, at least some people are tuning in because of feeling this suffering and this distress. And so I do want to say if anyone is at wit's end and if anyone needs help, I want to put the information for the suicide prevention lifeline here, which is 800-273-TALK, right? 800-273-8255. And the website is suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Now, I'm not affiliated with the organization, but it seems like they do good work. So if you do need help, please do reach out to them. And with that said, how do we start a conversation about this rooted in love, right? Not just concepts, but in love. Well, I think you just get right to it. So what we're going to start with today is a brief meditation on love, right? How do we bring love to something? We feel it. We bring it out. We emphasize it. We make it a choice. And so that's what we're going to do right now. So take some deep breaths and bring your attention within the body. Whichever area of the body needs attention. We're talking roughly about the physical structure now, the physical body. So somewhere within the confines of the physicalized structure, allow the attention to rest. And breathe in and out of this locus of attention. And know that there are several hundred people doing this along with you, along with me. Breathe in the sense of spaciousness. And if it's too difficult, or if that feeling isn't coming, or that sense isn't there, then simply be with us. Everyone is in their own place, and still we're all connected. Each of us holding space for ourselves and each other. Leaning on each other, creating for each other. If you can, feel the warmth, the softness, the possibility. Love is simple and always here, though certainly it may not always be felt. All right, and some full breaths. And so I like that, Carol. Loving from France. Love to you all from Austria. Great. Okay, so love and understanding. So, from this place of love, let's move into action and understanding. So, let's look at these phrases, mental health and mental illness, and see them through the lens of second mind medicine. So, first, when we talk about mental health and mental illness, of course, what we're talking about is the mind, right? So, if a person comes to the ER, let's say, and they're having a fever and they're having a cough and they're bringing up green sputum and their heart rate's a little fast, their breathing's a little fast, then I might evaluate them, listen to the lungs, hear what their experience is, and at some point I may diagnose pneumonia, right? And say, okay, well, what's going on is there's pneumonia happening. And so they'll say, okay, well, what is that? Right? What is pneumonia exactly? So then I might describe, well, pneumonia is an infection of the lungs. So essentially what we're talking about is a problem of the lungs. Now, if this person goes on and says, okay, well, what exactly is the lungs? Of course, generally we know what the lungs are, but let's just give an example here. Well, what are these lungs that we're talking about? I say, well, the lungs are the organs that help us breathe. They allow us to bring in oxygen, an essential nutrient that the entire body requires. It allows us to get rid of carbon dioxide, which otherwise would be toxic. So it's this kind of filter that brings in what we need, especially oxygen, and sends out what we don't need. That's what the lungs are. Okay, so the patient might say, yes, okay, I see what the lungs are. Can you tell me where they are? And I say, okay, well, the lungs they're here in the thorax. There's a right lung and a left lung, and they're situated on either side of the thorax. And below it is the diaphragm, above it is the neck. You have the chest wall on both sides. So I can tell them where the lung is and what the lung is. So with a problem of the lung, we can do that. With a problem of the kidney, we can do that. With a problem of the liver or of the pancreas or even of the heart, we can do that. But when it comes to mind, and when we say, well, this is a mental illness, if we ask the question, okay, can you tell me what the mind is? Well, at least from a medical standpoint, we're at a loss because we don't know. We don't study this, in fact, the nature of mind, right? If you say, well, okay, well, how does a mind function? Well, we can give a few theories, but there's no established base of knowledge on that. Okay, where is the mind? Can you show me where it is? We can't say that either. So I'm drawing this distinction between the heart, the lung, the kidney, and the mind just to say that when we talk about mental illness, right, what we're doing is essentially creating this phrase for a very colloquial usage of mind, right? All of us have a general sense of what mind is, right? But when we talk about mental illness, it is not pertaining to a specific organ or a specific thing. It is largely a colloquial phrase that then we've put in the context of a biomedical frame, right? Or a materialist frame. And that's important to understand because the lens through which we understand the mind, primarily in medicine, is through that materialist framework, through the first mind framework. And therefore, mind is often seen as a result of brain, and the various theories of mind and how it relates to identity and the world are secondary to that. All right, so this is important because it's important to differentiate between the idea of suffering and the idea of a distressing experience, which all of us have, and that being classified as a mental illness. All right, so what are we understanding in our understanding of mental illness? In this phrase, mental illness, what is it that we are misunderstanding, rather? Here are the few key things that are missing as it stands today. Number one is the big picture of how the mind develops over a lifetime or even over lifetimes, plural. All right, think about this. Anytime we think about an illness or anytime we think about distress, Anytime we think about an illness or anytime we think about distress, it's always against the backdrop of a natural function and how it progresses. So, if we think about growth of the physical body, there's a standard understanding in society about how the body grows. We know there's that infant stage, then there's the child, then there's pre-puberty, puberty, young adult, and so on. We might not use those phrases, we might not name the phrases, but all of us know what those stages are like and what the growth through those stages is, right? And any idea of a growth disorder would be against the backdrop of that understanding of what growth should look like. But when it comes to the mind, right, a standard understanding of how the mind develops over not just a lifetime, but lifetimes is not part of our understanding. It's not part of our study. And so, because of that, we take the mind out of context, right? We fail to juxtapose, generally speaking, we fail to juxtapose the development of the mind against the backdrop of the expectations of society, right? Jiddu Krishnamurti was a philosopher who said a very appropriate phrase here. He said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So, what we're seeing here is that if we don't know what the nature of the mind is, how the mind develops over a lifetime or of lifetimes, and then contrast that against the expectations of a society, then we have no solid foundation to go on to begin with, right? A solid knowledge base to go on to determine the extent of illness, how illness develops, and what can be done. And so that brings us to the first big point, which is that this this movement we're seeing now around social justice is such an important component of what we would call mental health or simply well-being, because each of us is inextractably part of this society, part of this greater fabric. And so when there are problems in society, they will always show up in the individual, just as if there's a problem with the individual, it shows up in the society. The point being that the two are not fundamentally different, right? We are inextricably linked. And so in our society today, we have a society in which people need to prove that they are worthy of housing, for example, right? That's why there's so much homelessness. People need to prove in some way that they are worthy of getting food, right? People need to prove that they are worthy of companionship or have inherent value. And when we have that kind of society, it's natural that our defenses to that or responses to that will show up at the individual level, right? Now, it's not just in these cases, of course, social justice, right? In when there's a discrepancy of power, as there is with women, as there is with minorities, as there is with blacks, in so many cases where these discrepancies of power, we're going to see what we call mental illness show up, which is essentially what? It is a problem that is in the society that is showing up at the individual level. Now, this is not a comprehensive description of the phrase mental illness, but I think it's probably one of the most important factors today. One of the most important factors today that we're not looking at in the realm of medicine, because we have this tendency to compartmentalize and separate. That's public health, that's social justice, that's politics or economics, and this is medicine. But we need to broaden this conversation to include that. So that's number one. Now, where does that show up in second mind medicine? Well, if you look at the 4 pillars of health, right, I'll put actually, before I forget, I'm going to put all of these up here in this post. I haven't updated the post yet, but I'll put all these put all these points rather in there. All right, let me see. Okay. So once I finish this talk later today or tomorrow, I'll update that link, but I just wanted to make it available here so that everybody can access it. Okay, so where were we? So as a result of localizing this problem strictly in the individual, we're not paying attention to this wider aspect. All right, so that's number one. What are we missing? We're missing the societal relationship of our well-being, right? And it shows up in the 4 pillars. If you go to the Second Mind Medicine website and go under posts and read about the 4 pillars, you can see that when we talk about nutrition, of course, nutrition is food, And yes, food makes a big difference in the state of the mind, right? You can keep a food diary or a food journal and see the relationship between food and how the mind changes. But beyond that, nutrition is also how we are nourishing ourselves, right? Who are the people we're spending time with? What are the ideas that we're absorbing? What are we being exposed to? This is also nutrition. This is a societal phenomenon. It's not only individual, right? When we talk about movement in the four pillars, yes, movement is of the physical structure, but movement is also of the mental body, meaning what? Creative expression, right? What does this mean? Having doubts, talking about the doubts, working them out, emotional expression, right? Instead of holding everything inside, being able to express ourselves emotionally. Emotional, mental, thought expression, understanding, in addition to energetic expression, right? What is the deeper energetic body and what does that expression look like? So all of this is movement, but in a society where this is not recognized, that is based in a materialist paradigm, and that thinks that all of this stuff is strictly spiritual, or it's strictly philosophical, or it's strictly religious, whereas in fact it's just simply our direct perception of reality, then movement, expression, all of these things become more difficult. So again, this is showing that that boundary between the individual and the society is a very fluid and translucent one if it exists at all, right? We are all part of this sea moving together. So nutrition, movement, rest, and connection, right? Connection in the four pillars is not only connection within, it is connection with others, and it's connection with the environment and the planet, right? So again, here, societal beliefs, understandings, practices, policies all come into play. So this first point about understanding how the mind develops over a lifetime and lifetimes, and juxtaposing that with societal practices and beliefs is the key, right? That is probably the biggest factor in addressing what we call mental illness, because in looking at that, we will see just how much we don't know about the mind, right? And just how much our focus has been in a very particular place, whereas this broader focus would probably bring a lot of solutions to the table. So I'm on my notes page here. I'm just going to switch back just to see. Kathy says, are these recorded, available? Yes, Kathy, they're all available here. All the videos are there, and I will update this later. All right. So that's the first point. The second point to talk about in terms of what we're missing is, of course, the 5 bodies of human anatomy, right? We're missing. So on one hand, we talked about how we're cut off from society in this understanding of mental illness, right? It becomes very localized in a person. That's the result of not recognizing this broader view. We tend to focus on the individual, and we kind of pour this dysfunction into an individual rather than seeing it across society. Now, the second thing is, not only are we compressed from that side, we're compressed within because there's a limited understanding of what we are, right? There's a limited understanding of the nature of the human being. So primarily, we see the physicalized structure. And of course, when we talk about the phrase mental health, mental illness, now we're talking about the mind as well, of course. But again, what is the understanding of this mind, right? It's not something we study in medical school. I have many friends who are psychiatrists. It's not something, nature of mind is not something we study much. I have many friends who are psychologists, and it's the same. So we might talk about the mind, but what is the depth of this mind, right? Is there something like the energetic body? Is there something like consciousness? Is consciousness actually primary? Or is it the physical structure itself that's primary and independent of consciousness, right? All of these questions, the lack of inquiry into these questions, I'm not only talking about a lack of answers, but a lack of inquiry. There's a general lack of curiosity about these kinds of questions. And when that's there, we get cut off from the deeper aspect of ourselves, right? So now we're talking about a further localization of a problem. It's been taken out of society and put into an individual. And now, even within the individual, most of that individual is not recognized And so it's being localized within the physicalized structure. All right. Of course, there's some mind. We talk about psychotherapy and we talk about the mind, but again, we're talking about the depth of understanding. And so what we're doing is hyper focusing on this physicalized structure, which is where the focus on the brain, the focus on neurotransmitters, the focus on dopamine, and the focus on serotonin, that's where all of this comes in, is as a result of this vision, this foundational vision that is lacking in understanding. All right. So I'm trying to paint the broad picture of how we arrive at the current understanding of mental illness and mental health. It is not that as human beings, we don't appreciate that there's a broader view. It's not that even as physicians or as professionals, we don't appreciate that. We do have something called the biopsychosocial model, which tries to emphasize that it's not only biology, but it's also psyche, the mind, and it's also society. But when we look at this in practice in medicine, it's a far cry from an actual deep understanding of societal factors and addressing them, as well as a deep understanding of mind and the different bodies as detailed in many wisdom traditions. All right. The other thing to talk about here, all right, let's see. Great. Thank you, Daniel. See your comments. Okay. So the other thing to talk about here that's important to understand is that in the deeper structure, once we take a consciousness-based perspective, right? If we decide that to investigate the primacy of consciousness and a model of anatomy based in that, then as we enter these energetic type structures, there are different ways of experiencing the world. And not only that, by using our attention in different ways, there are different frames of experience, or what we might call different dimensions of experience, of perception, that can be accessed. Now, of course, there's stories about this everywhere, right? You see movies about this, about alternate dimensions, right? In physics, we talk about how many different dimensions there may be. In spirituality, they talk about mystics who access different dimensions. All of these, the meanings of all of these don't quite line up, but they all suggest the exact same thing, which is that there are other frames of experience, other frames of activity that we may or may not be able to access, right? And what I'm saying is, in this model of second mind medicine, that these functions are accessible. In fact, this is exactly what psychedelic treatments are becoming popular for, because what psychedelics often do is they alter the sense of self. They change the sense of identity, such that identity is not necessarily one within the body, but also, two, it's not necessarily localized, meaning that it's neither an in-body experience nor an out-of-body experience. It simply can include or not include the body at all, right? And if you look at what second mind medicine is, it's derived from the three minds framework. And that three minds framework is entirely about this topic. It's about the sense of identity and how it can change, and how, based on the changing of identity, perception changes and our understanding of what the world is and what a lifetime is changes. Right? So all this to say that in accessing a more complete understanding of human anatomy, there are ways to work with identity to change the fields of perception. And this would completely change at least part of our understanding of what we call psychosis, or what we call hallucinations, right? Hallucinations certainly can be creations of the individual mind. It is possible, right? To avoid some kind of stimulus, to avoid some kind of trauma, or to avoid some kind of situation that's too difficult to face. Certainly the mind can create hallucinations. But then what's to differentiate between a hallucination and a perception that is there that someone else cannot see? This becomes very tricky. And the only way we can start to untangle this is by understanding the full capacity of the mind. All right, so this is the second main point. The first one was understanding how the mind develops over a lifetime, over lifetimes, and juxtaposing that with society and societal expectations. And secondly, understanding the full nature or the full anatomy of being human, and the different functions of that full anatomy and what they suggest, right? And as we said, as a result of not having these kinds of understanding, problems and difficulties and suffering and distress gets localized within an individual and then also within the physicalized aspect of the individual and within a lifetime. All right, so I know I'm talking about a lot of stuff here. I'm just going to run through some of the comments here. All right, great. Now, the third thing I want to talk about in terms of our understanding is trauma. So from what I'm seeing, trauma is becoming, and the idea of trauma, the concept of trauma, is becoming an increasingly popular and useful way to understand the mind, to delve into the mind, and to unravel those aspects that are within us that we're not able to access, right? And to ultimately, the point is to increase the sense of ease and decrease suffering. Now, three things I want to add to that conversation about trauma. One is there is a concept of intergenerational trauma, right? That's trauma that's handed down over generations that also affects us as individuals. To that, we need to add the concept of interlifetime trauma, right? The idea that an individual, when we look at the five bodies model, the physicalized structure is the outer layer. It's the fifth body. When the fifth body deteriorates, it is not that the other four bodies disappear, right? When the fifth body deteriorates is what we call death, right? Or when it stops moving altogether, we call this death. But in this model of human anatomy, you can see that the other layers still exist, right? And so when another body grows on, so to speak, when another physicalized aspect grows on, then we call that another lifetime, right? It's not recognized, of course. It's not something that's standard, but this possibility has to be something that we consider. So something that shows up in this lifetime that can seem random, that can seem out of the blue, of course, it could just be in the subconscious mind. It could be something that we haven't looked at. And so by talking to somebody who is skilled at bringing out those aspects, that can help to bring out some of the underlying factors or whatever kind of meaning that we attribute to what is happening in our life. That is certainly helpful. The other possibility is that it is not necessarily in this lifetime. So this cause might not be found, right? It could be from the mental body, from the energetic body, from the deeper aspects of anatomy of what we are that is showing up now in this physical structure, right? So this is an understanding of inter-lifetime trauma to add to the understanding of intergenerational trauma. This also speaks to what we call karma. Karma is a hugely important concept in this, in general in life, but especially if we're talking about this in terms of mind and in terms of body, right? Karma is often understood as the burden or like what I've done wrong or what we have to bear in this life. And that is not what karma is. Karma is essentially this kind of this action response chain. It's the link of action and response, right? Just like Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That is essentially karma. He was speaking about it in the physical realm specifically. But if you look at the overall picture, at all layers of subtlety, karma is simply the cause, effect, action, response thread that runs through all experience, right? So it doesn't have to be about something good that happens or something bad that happens. It is simply that something happens at all is karma at its subtlest level, right? Cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. And so it can be a seed that is in the mental body or in the energetic body that can sprout and show itself in the physicalized structure, right? And that itself can be the effect of karma, or that is, in a subtle way, the effect of karma. So all of these understandings can help to simply make sense of things that seem random. That's why this is important. All right, so just going to pause here. Mike, thanks for your comment. Denise, interlifetime trauma. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to emphasize this over and over. So interlifetime trauma, when we say this, if somebody just clicks in now and listens to it, it can sound totally off the wall. But there's a reason it sounds totally off the wall. And the reason it sounds totally off the wall is because We are trained in a materialist paradigm. So please understand this, right? It is not that it's off the wall, period. It is that if we believe in a materialist paradigm, if we believe that physicality is primary, if we believe that consciousness and mind are created by the brain and are limited to the brain, then yes, talking about another lifetime sounds like it's pure religion or sounds like it's pure spirituality. What I'm saying is, no, this is actually pure common sense. This is pure perception, right? As much as you might see the wall in front of you, or as much as you might see my face in front of you, similarly, as perception changes, the fuller aspect of what we are also becomes visible. But intellectually, to appreciate that, we have to at least make room for the curiosity that consciousness itself can be primary, and the entire implication of the second mind and the three minds framework, which is that consciousness is not only some small thing in the brain, but there is a broader field-like nature to it, and so on, all of those implications. So whenever we're talking about things that are not accepted as by the scientific community or by the mainstream academic community, just understand that it goes back to making room for another philosophy, and it goes back to introspective practice. All right. So we've talked about 1 and 2, how the mind develops over a lifetime, juxtaposed against society. And number 2, we've talked about a lack of understanding of the full nature, the full anatomy of the human being. All right. And now we're on number 3, trauma. We talked about not just intergenerational, but interlifetime trauma. Also want to talk about the concept of association. In trauma, we often talk about dissociation, right? So if there's a painful experience, we will dissociate from that by going to another experience, right? It's the way that the mind protects itself. But we also have to talk about association, which is, at least in this case, associating across our 5 bodies. The standard model that we are taught of being human is a dissociated model, because it says that what we are is a body, and then we have some thoughts. Those atoms that comprise the brain somehow magically create thought or create emotions or create something else, right? So this is a dissociated model of human anatomy because it recognizes only a fraction of what we are as our identity, or as a fundamental component or part of what we are. All right, so we need to start talking about association as well, not just dissociating from one experience to another, but rather associating across all experiences of being human. So in that case, it's not just about accessing the second mind. It's not that everything is about the second mind. First mind is important. The sense of boundary is important. Language is important. Communication is important. Engaging in society is important. And all of these can be done only with some sense of boundary, right? That the first mind provides. However, when we talk about association, we see that, okay, it's associating across and through all of these boundaries. This is where the sense of identity rests and becomes full and feels content and is at ease, right? Rather than, it's not just about integrating one experience or something that happened in the past, because even after doing that, there can still be a dissociation, but it is not the kind of dissociation that our society recognizes, because the very understanding of anatomy is incomplete. All right. And then the final thing about trauma is, another way to look at trauma is we can think of trauma as opaque boundaries, right? An opaque boundary is a kind of trauma. So if there's some event that I'm unable to access, or I can't, or I don't want to access, and that boundary is opaque, it's preventing me from accessing some aspect of myself, right? So this, again, creates a kind of dissociation, this opaque boundary, which can be with a particular experience, a particular memory, or it can also be across our identity, as it happens when, for example, the opaque boundary of physicality, and I'm primarily looking at myself as a physical structure, or the opaque boundary between the second and the third body, such that, or sorry, between the third and the fourth body, right? Between the mental and energetic body, there can be an opaque boundary. So that is a kind of trauma or a dissociated experience, right? So just a couple different ways to talk and think about trauma. This is for, I know there are many people here who are specialists in trauma or who work clinically in this field. So just some different ways to think about this. All right. So as a result of these three, right, as a result of this lack of understanding of how the mind may develop over lifetimes, I want to add something here. It is not that nobody understands this. I'm not saying that nobody understands this or nobody studies this, but this is not a standard understanding. These understandings need to become standard if we want to address what we're calling mental illness or mental health. Essentially, if we want to address these kinds of distress, these kinds of suffering, then this kind of understanding or some related understanding somewhere in this neighborhood, it needs to become standard. Just as everyone understands generally how the body should develop, at least the exterior of the physical structure, right? How it develops over time. It's not specialized knowledge. And similarly, for the mind, this should not be specialized knowledge. Mind is something that everyone has or everyone is experiencing. And so how it develops must also be part of that general knowledge. As a result of this lack of understanding in these areas, what we call stigma results, right? So there's a big conversation now around stigma in mental health. And I saw somebody tweet recently saying that, everyone or most people experience mental illness and it should not be a stigma or something along these lines. And I think this is the exact wrong way to go about it, right? Solving stigma isn't about saying that everyone suffers, so there's stigma, right? The idea that everyone experiences suffering is true. At some point, we experience suffering. At some point, we experience distress. There's no doubting this, right? But the stigma around that comes because we don't understand the mind. We don't understand how it develops. People have this innate sense that there is much more to the mind than what we understand and what we know. And that's not part of the general understanding. And it's not even part of the professional understanding in most cases. And so this ignorance is where the stigma comes from, right? This ignorance and this inability to talk about that which seems so obvious, which is that there's a huge hole in our understanding, right? The inability to talk about that while being framed as mental illness. This is stigma. This is very important to understand. The stigma is not in saying that we suffer, that I suffer, or that I have distress, or this person has distress, or somebody else has emotional suffering. There's no stigma in that, really. The stigma comes from the ignorance, the lack of understanding, and then forcing these labels without having that broader understanding. All right, so if we want to solve the problem of stigma, then what we need to do is, number one, admit what we don't know. Number two, become curious, be bold enough, courageous enough to become curious about what we don't know. And I'm speaking now specifically to professionals, right? We have to admit what we don't know. We have to become curious enough and courageous enough to say, hey, I want to look into this stuff. It doesn't make sense to me. This sounds like it's just philosophy, or this sounds just very spiritual. It doesn't make sense to me, but maybe there's something there. Let me look into this, right? That kind of curiosity and courage has to be there, because it is not where biomedical expertise lives. So that is the issue with stigma. And of course, as a result of all this, also focusing on neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, because that is where our expertise is. It is in a materialist and physical-based understanding. Not to say there aren't great psychotherapists. There are. There are a lot of great psychologists, a lot of great psychiatrists who understand the mind more deeply. But it is not the standard. We need to make this the standard and see the human being more completely. All right. So these are the main points that I wanted to touch on in terms of bettering our understanding of mental health and mental illness. And so what are the solutions? The solutions aren't magic. The solutions aren't rocket science. There's nothing new really to talk about here in terms of solutions, right? Remember, what we're talking about as second mind medicine is an overall approach to medicine. We're not talking about a specific solution to a specific problem. But the overall issue that we're talking about today in terms of mental health mental distress, mental illness, what we're framing with these words, the solutions are number one, advocacy and social justice. It's probably the number one biggest issue, right? And we're seeing that now. Fortunately, in the last few years, we're starting to see social justice taking a prominent role and now showing up in conversations about general well-being, not just in terms of politics, but foundational general well-being in society depends on social justice and advocacy. So that's number one. Number two, education, right? Critical thinking about identity, critical thinking about different views on the self and the world and perception, and introspective practice, right? We need a revolution in terms of a supplemental curriculum from grade school through graduate school through professional school to look at these issues, right? To look at identity, critical thinking about identity, the relationship between identity and the world and how that relates to perception. And finally, the introspective practices to start to experience this, not just thinking about that intellectually, but introspecting and developing that sensitivity to appreciate what we're talking about, right? We need some kind of supplemental educational curriculum starting from grade school all the way through graduate and professional school. And I'm not talking primarily about students, I'm talking about for teachers and professors and clinicians. Because we, the ones who have the authority, the ones who have authority to diagnose or to assign labels, we are the ones who need the education because we are the ones kind of creating the story around all this. Now there's more balance, of course, with social media and with the internet and with the podcasts and blogs. There's a lot more balance that we're seeing now. But the curriculum has to be for students, teachers, professors, clinicians, everybody. We all need to learn just these basics. And yes, it can be taught in grade school. Children are generally more creative, have more imagination, and many times more intelligent than adults because they haven't been suppressed yet, right? Their ideas, their imagination, their vision, their perception hasn't been narrowed yet. They haven't yet been told that's not okay. All the other stuff is not okay. And so, yes, we absolutely can start in grade school, but it needs to go up all the way through grad school and professional school to look at some of these basic issues and to see that many of our assumptions are actually simply beliefs. Many of our assumptions about mind are beliefs, but we were never told they're beliefs because we've been told since childhood what is true and what is not true, and we haven't questioned that. So that is something that needs to be part of it. And number three is relationships with those who have experience, right? And you can't really say too much about this. You can't say enough about this, I should say, because ultimately intellectual understanding only goes so far. And even introspection, when we really do introspection and get into some of these, we encounter the weeds, which is why the topic is so difficult, right? This is why dealing with trauma is difficult. This is why dealing with the different ways in which the mind represents itself, right? Through perception and through thought, all of these different ways become difficult to manage at some point because we're going very deeply into identity. So having relationships with those who have experience is invaluable, right? So like I said, there's no rocket science here, but these are key essential steps. If we're going to talk about what we call mental health or mind and distress, suffering, well-being, mental illness, if we want to talk about all these things, we need to have a broader foundation of knowledge established through advocacy, through education, and through forming relationships with those who have experience in these matters. All right. Education should include medical school, Jennifer says. Of course, absolutely. Denise, voices need to be heard. Breaks my heart when patients are not heard. Yes, absolutely. Completely agree. All right. So if there are any questions, let me know. You can write them here and we'll take a look at those next week. And I will update the post Let me just put that in here. This will be the post that will be updated in the next day or so with the key points. All right, so let's stop here and go back. We talked about love and understanding as key in addressing distress and suffering. One more thing I'll talk about here that I think is a difficult conversation is I see on Twitter there's a large conversation, there's an ongoing conversation about this, right? And I chime in once in a while with my 2 cents here and there. You know, the overall movement, the overall direction we need to move in is the work I'm trying to put in through the Three Minds framework, through Second Mind Medicine. But once in a while, I'll just chime in a note here or there to add my voice to that conversation that's happening around this conversation around mental health, mental illness. What is the mind? What is mental health? What needs to be done? And it's a very divisive conversation, right? It's an active conversation. It's often a very antagonistic conversation because, of course, in a professional setting, there is an imbalance in power, right, between the professional and between the client or between the patient, right? And Twitter is one of those places where there's no imbalance. Everyone can say what they think and it can just be put out there. So there's a lot of antagonism there. And what I can say from the professional side, just from knowing my own colleagues, is I can say is that, it's the entire professional expertise is largely built on this biomedical perspective. And the inquiry into subtler philosophy and what's called spirituality and other traditions, including the wisdom traditions of the East and indigenous traditions, these aren't part of the standard curriculum. Of course, there are professionals who understand this, but that usually comes from additional learning, extracurricular learning outside the professional curriculum. So part of the issue here is, of course, the threat to the current professional status and the professional education as it stands now. And that's also something that's important to understand, because until that is also addressed, this whole system change is not going to happen, right? That the education and some way to move beyond this biomedical understanding for professionals as well is also key to this. All right. So with that, we'll switch off the thoughts for a while. And I don't mean literally switch off. I mean leave them aside. And by not giving attention to them, they kind of drift off into the sea. All right. See a couple questions here. Let me just answer one or two of these. So yes, if we talked about introspection, you have to understand that all of these steps are not for everyone at this time. There's a right time for everything. So in terms of introspection, some forms of meditation can actually be distressing depending on the state of the mind at that time, right? In fact, in general, many people think meditation is supposed to go a particular way or certain things are supposed to happen. And if that doesn't happen, it can actually become a form of distress, right? Or when we start to enter the mind more deeply, those aspects that were suppressed or were not seen before start to come up, and that can cause distress. So it's not just a matter of saying introspection and diving in, right? There's a way, there's a time, and that's where what I talked about relationships with those who have experienced this and gone through this, that's where that guidance becomes essential. That's important. And then the question about healthcare professionals. So I think it's always important to be in conversation with the people that are trying to help, with the people that you are looking to for some kind of help or assistance, right? In my view, that's essential. So if you are on some kind of plan or some kind of treatment, talk to your healthcare professional, about your ideas, about what you think may be helpful. I don't suggest making any changes by yourself if you're already on some kind of road, right? Because this has to be done in tandem. It is a process that has to be inclusive and not just by making sudden turns here and there, right? What we're talking about is an overall framework and overall approach that we need in each individual case, of course, where it's accessed, where the five bodies are accessed, where the second mind framework is accessed, is going to be different, and their individual guidance is always helpful. So thank you for joining me. This is a very important conversation, and please share this, and I will see you next week.